Thank you very much. Let me start with thanking the organizers for inviting me to come share my research here today with you. Although I haven't been to any Third Millennium conferences before, certainly not the one 25 years ago, I've actually been studying corded-ware and bell beaker funerary practices and depositional practices for the last 15 years at Leiden University as part of a research group led by Professor David Fontijn, who sadly passed away a few months ago. During that time, I also started my own business that became Sidestone Press, which keeps me quite busy. So, long story short, I don't get out much. And during the midst of COVID, I got to finally defend my PhD in a largely empty room, where Martin Furholt, via Zoom, was one of my external referees, and he invited me to come speak to you here today. So if there's any complaints, Martin is over there. You can address those to him. But let's get started. But before I do, I want to make a big disclaimer. The data that I studied were all from the Netherlands. So that means that specific patterns, and thus also specific meanings, can be entirely different for other regions. In the Netherlands, the transition from the communal megalithic tombs of the funnel beaker culture to the first burial mounds that cover single individuals is seen as evidence for a more stratified society, where certain people had become more important than others. Moreover, some of the objects found in these graves are traditionally interpreted as weapons, which is taken to indicate that this transition involved violence. So from egalitarian farmers of the funnel beaker culture, we go to corded-ware and bell beaker warrior chiefs. However, is that really what happened? The weapon of choice in the corded-ware graves is, of course, the battle axe. However, when examining the actual objects, I found that they showed extensive traces of wear and even repair. You can see deep grooves, striations, and heavy traces of use around the cutting edge. And this is much, much more than you would expect to see on an average stone axe. Some of these were completely worn away. If you want to get such levels of wear from smashing in people's head, it's doubtful that anyone actually survived the Third Millennium. But in order to investigate this more scientifically, we made replica axes. And we ordered 20 or so chopped off animal heads. And again, a disclaimer, I am a trained useware specialist, so please do not try this at home. In a very scientific manner, we chopped in a head well over 300 times, only to find that after this massacre, almost zero wear traces had developed. So this made it extremely clear that although if you want to chop in a head, you can, but this is not what caused the extensive traces seen on the archaeological artifacts, which means that in daily life, they must have been used for something entirely different. After doing various experiments, we did find that virtually identical traces developed when using a so-called battle axe to chop through tree roots, something you would do if you want to get rid of tree trunks. So instead of battle, these objects would more likely have been used to transform a natural forested landscape into one that is suitable for plowing and wheeled transport. Two technologies that find widespread adoption in the Third Millennium BC. And this also serves to illustrate that things might not always be what they seem. And if you want to try it out under supervision, I brought one, so you can have a go with it. And you'll find that it's quite difficult to maneuver such a heavy stone on such a thin stick. Always bring props. But enough about the corded-ware. It is the bell beakers that we wanted. We can make some useware, but then there will even be fewer people in the hall. As mentioned, I'm a useware specialist, and so the focus of my research lay on studying objects and artifact biographies. Which objects are found in graves, how were they made, used, and deposited? And what does this tell us about the identity of the dead? Grave goods are traditionally interpreted in terms of status or prestige. So graves with either more objects or more exotic objects are often classified as higher status individuals. However, in my dataset, I found no evidence that accumulation in terms of quantity of objects or numbers of different categories was deemed important. Any grave could contain any number of objects from the set, 1, 2, or more. This could be a simple flint flake and a beaker, or a gold ornament. But having gold did not mean that you had to have any other goodies. Any combination could occur. Traditionally, we also tend to focus on some objects more than others. The things that we find sexy feature predominantly in our interpretations, whereas the things we don't find sexy are often ignored. So for the Bell Beaker period, we sometimes see the inclusion of archery equipment. Therefore, these graves are seen as archers or warriors' graves. But is this really so? The most frequently occurring type of object in my dataset, apart from the beaker, is actually just a set of flint tools. Mostly just some simple flakes, with some with traces of woodworking. And likewise, in the corded ware, stone and flint axes were far more common than the so-called battle axes. But let me ask you, how many carpenters' graves do we have in the archaeological literature? As we all know, the Bell Beaker grave goods are part of a set, known as the Bell Beaker package. But even here, it seems not to have been the case that people try to get buried with a full package. Instead, a sort of pars pro toto system seems to have been in place. For example, half the graves with wrist guards had 0 arrowheads, and half the graves with arrowheads had no wrist guard. So it was apparently not important to be buried with a full set of items, but rather to just have a few that referred to this common Bell Beaker package. The objects in graves seem to have referred to a certain ideal, a stereotype, if you will, but with some degree of humility. In the same sense, perhaps, that during a Christian burial, some passages from the Bible are read, but not the full book. Again and again, people are placing certain objects in graves, while at the same time, other objects were systematically avoided. So if we want to better understand these graves, we have to look at all these objects as a set. So let's just do that and have a look at the most frequently occurring objects in beaker graves. First of all, we have the beakers, probably used for serving alcoholic beverages and meticulously decorated in a pan-European style. Despite the fact that they are all seemingly unique, they follow a certain set of stylistic rules so that they are easily recognizable as bell beakers. Although often not even depicted in our publication, the next most common thing in a bell beaker grave is a set of flint tools. They can be used as they are or easily transformed into other tools. These include simple flint flakes, scrapers, but also striker lights for making fire. In third place, we have archery equipment. Although functional, we are again dealing with objects made in a specific style. Simple triangular or transverse arrowheads served perfectly fine for millennia, just as a leather cuff was more than enough to protect the wrist. But no, those fancy bell beaker people needed cool, barbed and tanked arrowheads and stone wrist guards. These could even be decorated or equipped with gold caps. So let me ask you, are these weapons or are these bling? Speaking of bling, next up are the ornaments. V-perforated amber buttons are found throughout Europe. One grave in the central Netherlands contained a whole set of them located on the forehead, so they were worn in a highly visible manner. And the same goes for the first gold ornaments. Although you can make any shape you want out of gold, we find again and again these peculiar ornaments with a round or petal-shaped end and curled-up tang. And even the decoration seems standardized. And we have been doing some experiments with them, and I brought also a copy of the top one, number C. So if you want to play around with some gold ornaments, you know where to find me. The copper tank daggers are among the first copper objects in the Netherlands. And both their style and metal signature appears to have a pan-European distribution. Traditionally, these objects are again interpreted as weapons. Some authors even mention these as precursors to the Bronze Age swords. But again, would you really carry these into combat? Most of them have blades that are only a few centimeters long. See, for example, how this compares to a modern paring knife used for peeling potatoes. Most of them are not even large enough to slice an apple. And note, this is all to scale. They are actually quite similar in size compared to a modern Swiss Army pocket knife. So, in summary, we are dealing here with rather peculiar warriors who went to battle armed with flint scrapers, woodworking tools, flamboyant jewelry, fire-making kits, and copper knives not big enough to attack most common fruits. So, can we maybe think of an alternative interpretation that actually fits all these objects? Interestingly, there is one closed context, non-grave find where all these items were found together, alongside the icy remains of Ötzi, found about 200 kilometers north of here. I visited him yesterday. A traveler crossing the Alps who was frozen in situ along with his equipment. Along on his travels, he brought with him a set of flint tools, a fire-making set, a bow and some arrows, containers with food and various items of dress. The same type of things we tend to find in beaker graves. My suggestion, therefore, is that we should regard these people in graves not as warriors dressed to go into combat, but actually as travelers, people equipped to go on a long journey. When we go on vacation, we bring our toothbrush and enough clean underwear. But imagine the world in the late Neolithic, and think of what you would need to make a long journey. There were no roadside hotels in those days, so you had to make your own fires at night to stay warm. You brought some flint flakes to make tools along the way, as they were needed to maintain your gear. And the only way to get food would be to hunt along the way with a bow and arrow, because there were, of course, no no McDonald's restaurants or roadside pizza or currywursts. You can't grow crops or set traps when you're traveling, and fruits and nuts are only available in certain times of year. So keeping an eye out for small game and shooting it with your bow is the only way to sustain a hungry traveler. The other way to get food is to meet other people and get invited into their homes. The interesting thing is that many of these objects are made in a very specific style and were worn on the body. Specific amber or gold ornaments, but also the colorful wrist guards. And indeed, these objects all show traces of wear and repair. So these were not items made solely to adorn the dead, they were worn by the living. These items of dress are found throughout Europe, indicating that over a vast area, people were presenting themselves in similar, relatable styles. Sociological studies show that uniform ways of personal presentation are intended to structure and facilitate social interaction. By presenting oneself in a standardized manner, strangers can more easily make their intentions known to potential hosts. That is why, if this guy shows up on your doorstep, you have no idea how to respond. This is a material idiom that bears no resemblance to our own. Whereas, if this person approaches you, you know exactly how to respond. Dressing according to a widely accepted stereotype is instrumental in establishing relations between strangers, who in turn should have a standardized way of reacting, in this case, by taking the hand and shaking it. In bell beaker times, for example, by inviting someone in for a drink from a beaker decorated in a standardized manner, and thus highly recognizable. So a standardized way for hosts to receive guests. We even have a Proto-Indo-European word for this, gosti, a reconstructed Pi word that describes a system of guest-host relationships that must have existed in Indo-European speaking societies. The word simultaneously meant both stranger, guest, and host, and described a system of hospitality and creating reciprocal relationships between strangers. So I would argue that the way people were dressed and equipped in graves made reference not to violence or warriorhood, but instead to traveling, as if they were being prepared to be sent off on a long journey. Something they may have also done in life, to visit faraway places, meet strange people, and obtain exotic objects and knowledge. And the evidence for this is quite obvious. You just have to look at the origin of exotic objects from the Dutch cordetware culture. Everything seems to have come exclusively from northern Germany and southern Scandinavia, regions where other cordetware people lived. This forms a stark contrast with the subsequent bell beaker culture, where objects and materials suddenly came in from all over Europe. Apparently, people sure got round in those days. But let's shift our focus away from the objects and take a closer look at the context in which they were deposited. Let's have a look at the actual graves. In the Netherlands, these are typically situated in burial mounds. These were usually low mounds of about 10 meters across and a meter high. At least some of them seem to have had some sort of revetment around the edge, so we probably have to reconstruct them not as mounds as they appear today, but actually as flat disc-shaped structures. In these barrows, the graves were oriented east-west, with people buried on either their left or right side while facing south. There is, however, quite some variation in this east-west orientation, and Lanting and van der Waals in their famous Bell Beaker paper already speak of a 45-degree deviation to either side. To me, this was a bit weird, because these people were buried with a very specific set of items, in a very specific type of monument, monuments that were located in very specific locations in the landscape, with their bodies in a very specific posture, in graves that were more or less east-west. So I actually measured the orientation of all the graves in our data set and plotted these in a graph, and found that indeed, we see that there's actually quite a lot of variation and not a very strong focus on true east-west. Most graves actually seem to fall in this wider range of about 50 to 130 degrees. If true east-west was the rule, we should expect to see a very strong preference for that, especially because people would have been able to point out the cardinal points. I mean, these were the people that lived in the time of Stonehenge or the enclosures of Pammelte in Germany. Massive monuments that mark the movements of the sun on specific days of the year, midwinter and midsummer. I think that this focus on the sun is also what structured the orientation of these graves. They did not simply point east, they pointed east to the rising sun. At our latitudes, the point on the horizon where the sun rises moves slowly from around 50 degrees in midsummer to 130 degrees in midwinter. And this is the range that we see in the orientation of graves. This would mean that people did not more or less orient their graves, they did so very specifically, just as they did with all the other things in the grave ritual. The careful observer will note that not all graves fall in this solar range. To that I have to admit that there are some outliers. Some of this may be attributable to poor quality of data, but there are certainly also some graves that truly deviate from this east-west pattern. I want to remind everyone that having skeletal remains or even body silhouettes is extremely rare in the Netherlands. So it is interesting to see that from these few deviating graves, I actually have two with a body silhouette and one even with some skeletal remains. And both of them are completely opposite to the pattern I just described. Both of these graves were oriented both of these pits were oriented more or less north-south, but the bodies were positioned in such a way that they were actually lying on their wrong side, and they were looking north instead of south. So we are actually having complete inversions of the normal pattern. The interesting thing is that neither of these individuals were human. Both were likely cattle. Both were found in primary graves underneath burial mounds. It is at this point where we may also want to question what exactly is a burial mound. I mean, if this presentation was meant to make you question things, we might as well continue. I think that one of the biggest obstacles in our ability to interpret graves is that we interpret them as graves. Let me unpack that for you. From our modern perspective, it is very clear that each of our lives is unique and important, that whenever we find the burial of a human body, we tend to project those values onto the past. But I think that what we are dealing here with is something else altogether. Let's have another look at the Garda burial, for example. This is the barrow with the cow. Oh, I'm sorry, the inverted cow. But in addition to the cow, there were also 2 human graves. All 3, as far as we can tell, are situated underneath the primary burial mound. So at some point in time, a group of people came together to dig 3 pits with very specific orientations and placed in these pits 2 humans and a cow in very specific postures and covered those pits with a burial mound. These were not random acts. There must have been some sort of narrative, some sort of rationale that explained why people did this. Apart from individual words, linguists can also partly reconstruct Proto-Indo-European myths by combining elements that are shared in the various Indo-European origin myths. And one goes like this. At the beginning of time, there were 2 brothers, twins. One named Man, the other Twin. They traveled through the cosmos, accompanied by a great cow. Eventually, man had to sacrifice Twin, or later, in some versions, the cow. And from the parts of the sacrificed body, with the help of the sky gods, everything was created. Man became the first priest, the creator of the ritual sacrifice that was at the root of world order. Although this may only be anecdotal evidence at best, I do think this illustrates that we might need to look at these burial mounds from a different perspective. Rather than glorious warrior chiefs being honored in death, we might actually be looking at the remains of communities coming together to periodically reenact some sort of origin myth or origin story. An act in which people in the here and now try to connect with the timeless cosmos. Some individuals are selected, dressed and equipped as travelers, laid in graves oriented on the rising sun. This strongly invokes the idea of people being prepared to join the sun on its travel across the sky, to become part of the eternal cycle of the heavens. Perhaps this is the same cycle that is depicted on the later Nebra disc, or celebrated at Stonehenge, along, in this case, with the sunboat to carry the traveler and the sun. But surely, these still must have been important people, right? Not everyone was buried in such a fashion. It is certainly true that not everyone was buried in such a manner, but that does not necessarily mean that these people had been important in life. I would argue that we must see these burials as part of much wider depositional practices, where certain things are deposited in certain places in the landscape. What we must realize is that burial mounds are no exception to this. We are all brought up in an egocentric society where personal freedom, identity, and accomplishments are seen as individual achievements, where graves are marked by a tombstone with a name and a date honoring that specific person. And this is automatically what we think about when we use the term grave. But what if we look at these graves more from the perspective of ritual depositions, where specific things were deposited in specific ways, in specific places? This is exactly what happens in these burial mounds. And the comparison actually goes further. If we look, for example, at wet context hoards of bronzes, we see the deposition of objects that would normally have been recycled. The normal life trajectory of a copper or bronze axe would have been production, use, possibly exchange, and recycling. Only in rare circumstances were objects removed from this cycle to be included in, for example, votive depositions or grave goods. There was nothing inherently special about these objects, not until they were selected for deposition instead of remelting. This is where their normal life trajectories took a different turn, where their biographies deviated from the norm. But when this happened, they were subjected to a highly structured form of deposition. I therefore speak of structured deviation, where normal objects are taken from their normal life trajectories and literally become out of the ordinary, but in a highly structured manner. Likewise, most dead people were treated in such a way that left no archaeological trace. Only in certain occasions, people were selected to feature in a special but highly structured form of deposition. The grave was not a context to simply deposit riches or exotic or rare objects. Many so-called prestigious items are actually systematically avoided in graves, such as copper axes or the beautifully crafted Scandinavian flint daggers. Only specific things in certain combinations were allowed to create a stereotypical image, one that transcended the individual and gave the impression of a timeless, universally shared practice, one that transcended space and time, where a member of the community was portrayed as a traveler welcoming the rising sun. While travelers in life may have connected communities far and wide in space, in death they would join the sun on its eternal cycle, perhaps to connect communities with their distant ancestors in time, to become, if you will, time travelers. And let me assure you, at dawn, these burial mounds are truly otherworldly. Thank you.